Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Reverend James Shannon, a Scots-Irish-American minister and educator who became one of the most prominent educators and pro-slavery voices of his time in the United States. He was born in Monaghan County, Ireland in 1799. After receiving his education at the University of Belfast, he was recruited by an Irish-born educator in Liberty County, Georgia, Reverend William McWhirr, to teach at his Sunbury Academy there. McWhirr had actually traveled to Belfast to recruit him, and they came back together to Georgia in 1820. Why are we even talking about Reverend James Shannon? He's not exactly a household name, either in Ireland or the United States, even though he really did have a notable academic career and he was very influential in the Church of Christ movement here. Well, he became one of the loudest proponents of slavery in the United States. At the peak of his career, he was head of the University of Missouri, and as a pro-slavery pastor and educator, he played a role in the border states' conflict over slavery that preceded the Civil War. He died in 1859, just before the American Civil War. He took enslaved people with him from Georgia to Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. Let's talk a little bit about Liberty County. Liberty County was ironically named Liberty County to honor its role in the American Revolution because it basically dragged Georgia into the war on the American side. I say ironically because although as a colony Georgia at first outlawed slavery, in the 1750s it relented and planters from South Carolina started flooding into Georgia, bringing with them the people they were holding in slavery. A large group of them came to Liberty County, which became primarily farming country, that is to say plantations, with a vibrant port town called Sunbury where the academy Shannon taught at was. Sunbury is now a ghost town with some housing developments and a nice restaurant, but at the time Shannon came there, it was a potential rival of Savannah. The Georgia coast had a big problem with yellow fever and malaria back in that day, and the white planters used to escape further inland during the warmer months, leaving their enslaved people on the plantations. I live on the coast just south of Liberty County, so I can tell you that I'm using the term warmer months euphemistically. It was a hellhole before air conditioning, and the warm season lasts from about March to October. They would leave their enslaved people on the plantations with just a white overseer, who was sometimes not even resident, just a visiting overseer. The enslaved people, who were mostly from West Africa, seized this opportunity to develop their own culture, which was an amalgam of the many different places they were from. This is known today as the Gullah Geechee culture. The people who would eventually be held in slavery by James Shannon came from this unique culture. This is a good point to talk about how I came to be giving this talk. My Ashmore ancestors came with the group from South Carolina in the 1750s and stayed in Liberty County. They were both slave owners and overseers. I was lucky enough to find documentation of the people they held in slavery, and when I started reaching out to their descendants, I found both that some of them were my cousins, and that it was so much harder for them to find the information that I had found fairly easily. I got mad about that, and then I did something. I started a website called theyhadnames.net to document references to named African Americans in Liberty County wills, estate inventories, deed records, church records, and so on. It now has over 40,000 references to named enslaved people. As I researched, I came across James Shannon in the 1830 census, but I didn't find him in Liberty County after that. I was curious, so I started researching him, and I found the story that I'm telling you now. So James Shannon, about 20 years old, arrives in Sunbury in 1820 to join McWhirr at the Sunbury Academy. McWhirr was born in County Down, Ireland in 1759, and he was ordained there as a Presbyterian minister. He had immigrated first to Virginia after the American Revolution, and he actually knew George Washington pretty well, since he taught his nephews. He remained an active Presbyterian minister throughout his life, and he became one of the most well-known educators in Georgia. The records of his life talk about how he lived off the proceeds of his school teaching. He did not. In fact, he married the well-off widow of a Revolutionary War soldier and came to control her enslaved people. He owned at least 20 of them until 1839, when he sold most of them, and he lived off the profits from that sale for the rest of his life. He was very well known in his lifetime for his strict discipline of his students, and in fact his cane, which he used on them, can be found at a local museum. What must it have been like to be under his complete control as an enslaved person? His students' parents, after all, could protest. James Shannon immediately showed some of the character traits that would help explain his later life. He was a hard-headed man and passionate in his beliefs and ideas. He was a Presbyterian and had been recruited by McWhirr as such, but when he got to Georgia, he immersed himself, so to speak, in reading about baptism and pretty quickly decided that he was actually a Baptist. The accounts of this present Shannon as a very principled person who made this decision even though it was not in his best interests, since he fell out with McWhirr over this. I can't help but wonder if that's true. McWhirr was associated with the Midway Church, which was essentially Presbyterian, but that church was not located in Sunbury. The Sunbury Baptist Church was, and many prominent families in Sunbury were Baptist. As it turns out, Shannon also wanted McWhirr's job. In a biography of Shannon, the author notes that others have linked his Irish descent to his rhetorical behavior, with one person calling him a tempestuous Irishman. A former student said, quote, "He was an enthusiast by nature and he entered with enthusiasm into everything that came properly before him," unquote. That's, of course, an American stereotype of the Irish, but it was believed at the time, and there were many references to Shannon's Irish heritage throughout his life, fondly from his wife, not so fondly from others. In 1823, Shannon married Evelina Dunham, who inherited 10 enslaved people from her aunt, as well as 150 acres of land in Liberty County. So I say that she inherited 10 people. She actually inherited half of each of them, sharing them and the land with her cousin William Way. It was called an undivided half. At that time in America, married women could not own property, so Evelina had trustees. The people and land would have become Shannon's when they married, so the usual practice, which they followed, was to sign a marriage settlement in which Shannon gave up control to her trustees of any property she came into the marriage with or would get afterwards. This document shows that she brought Isaac, Luke, Sarah, Bob, Jack, Tony, Summer, Anthony, Ned, and Sylvia into their marriage. Imagine how these enslaved people felt about this young Irish man suddenly coming into their lives. For that matter, imagine how they felt when Evelina's aunt, Martha Carter, had died. It must have been terrifying every time a slave owner died, wondering what would happen. In this case, Martha Carter had said in her will that she wanted the Negroes, her words, kept together on the plantation where they were, unless one of the heirs married and wanted a division. Well, of course the heirs were going to marry and want a division. When Evelina did marry and they were divided, the documents show that they came to Martha Carter from her husband, James Carter, who left them to her in his 1804 will. So these people's presence in Liberty County can be traced back by name to at least 1804. How did Shannon feel about slavery at that time? He was not passive in his response to having enslaved people brought into the family through inheritance. If he was against slavery, he had convinced himself otherwise by then. First, he purchased Chloe, a 45-year-old woman said to be Anthony's wife. In 1826, he bought Peggy, Rose, Bella, David, and Derry from Samuel S. Law, a prominent Baptist, and Tamar from William Ward. He owned them outright, not through his wife. There may have been more, but these are the records we have. Shannon later wrote that in his youth he was completely opposed to slavery, but after study and reading the Bible, he came to realize that it was biblically ordained. I am guessing that, as with the conversion to baptism, this conversion probably came at a convenient moment, perhaps when his wife inherited enslaved people. While doing this research, I was able to obtain a copy of the Shannon Family Bible from the State Historical Society of Missouri. It listed his enslaved people and had their birth dates. With that and other records, I've been able to put together this chart of the people Shannon owned. The documents underline the timeline events across the top are on my website. So what kind of slave owner was Shannon? Slavery was an evil and harsh institution. Too often in American history, enslaved people are portrayed as backdrops. Slave owners are shown as leading these happy lives while being silently served. In fact, rebellions, both large and small, were frequent and feared. Slave owners used harsh discipline to enforce their dominance, whether it was carried out by the slave owner himself or herself, or an overseer. Kind, in quotes, slave owners only used slightly less harsh discipline. By 1822, Shannon had become the principal of the Sunbury Academy after McWhirr was apparently forced to retire. 4 years later, he put an ad in a Savannah newspaper saying he was planning to open a boys' and girls' school in Augusta, Georgia, which is on the Georgia-South Carolina border. The ad included a statement as regards discipline, in which he said that based on the Bible and his own experience, it was impossible to teach children without the use of fear, and that he did not want any students whose parents weren't willing for him to cane them. Remember that McWhirr was also very discipline-oriented. McWhirr was in fact considered more so than most of his era. So what must it have been like to have been held in slavery by a man who was so wedded to beating children that he felt the need to include it in an advertisement? I mean, the ad suggests that parents in Sunbury had complained, right? In 1826, Shannon was called to become the pastor of the Augusta Baptist Church, where he was paid the highest salary paid to any minister in the state, a sign of his growing prestige. He was said to have been influential in the education and mentoring of many future prominent Baptist ministers in Georgia. What happened to the enslaved people? It seems likely that they remained in Liberty County on the plantation because they were enumerated there by number and gender only in the 1830 census. By 1830, James and Evelina had moved to Athens, Georgia, where Shannon became the chair of ancient languages at Franklin College of the University of Georgia, the first rung on what would be a prominent academic career. Interestingly, his appointment there was at least partially based on his being a Baptist preacher, as there was not a Baptist on the faculty at the time, and the Georgia Baptists wanted to see that changed. Religious discrimination was very much a thing at that time. Shannon was a very well-known Baptist preacher and had been called one of the 12 apostles of Georgia Baptist education. He and Evelina now had a young daughter, and Shannon's brothers, Joseph and John, who had immigrated and who were medical doctors, were living with them. They also had with them 2 enslaved men and 3 enslaved women. We don't know who they were, but I am assuming at least one was Tony, about whom we'll hear more later. While there, Shannon's brother Joseph got a loan, and Shannon and his wife's co-inheritor, William Way, used the enslaved people they had inherited as collateral for the loan, meaning that they, the enslaved people, would have been sold at the courthouse at auction if Joseph had defaulted. Shannon also sold Tamar and Peggy away from Liberty County to Twigg County. In 1835, Joseph became head of the College of Louisiana, now known as Centenary College. Evelina was struck by the difference in culture there, and fortunately, some of her letters have survived. She wrote to her good friend Frances Carey Moore in 1836 that, quote, "We are beset on all sides for our servants. They wonder how we happen to have so many smart servants," unquote. Smart at the time meant well turned out. It was more how you appeared than say, intelligence. She added that one of them was hired out by the day, and then she said, quote, "Tony says tell Miss Frances to tell his father and mother howdy from them all, and that he has a son and has called him Anthony," unquote. This is the only record I could find of the birth of Anthony, about whom we'll hear later. Tony, his father, was born on September 3rd, 1810 in Liberty County, as we know from the Shannon Family Bible. While in Louisiana, Shannon's intense belief in the power of his own intellect to challenge established principles resulted in his joining the Restoration movement, which focused on biblical authority and unity. It was trying to restore the church to its New Testament purity by rejecting the idea of denominations. The group was known as the Disciples of Christ. He would remain with this group for the rest of his life. As with the other major changes in his beliefs, from Presbyterian to Baptist, from anti-slavery to pro-slavery, this could be viewed as coming at a convenient time, even though it was controversial, given the intense focus in academic life at the time on religious allegiance. Remember that his Baptist faith was an issue in his appointment at Franklin College. Maybe it was easier to be non-denominational. On the other hand, people are complicated, and there were likely a number of factors involved in this and his other conversions. He did seem to feel the need to persuade himself of the righteousness of his choices through his biblical interpretations. Evelina died in Jackson in 1836, and in 1837, James Shannon married her good friend Frances Carey Moore, the one she wrote the letters to. The 1840 census listed Shannon as owning one male child under 10 years old, one man aged 24 to 35, another man aged 36 to 54, a girl aged 10 to 23, and a young woman aged 24 to 35. The child under 10 years old was probably Tony's son Anthony, and the young man and woman were presumably Anthony's parents. I'm still researching whether Frances Moore brought any enslaved people into the marriage. In 1840, Shannon became president of Bacone College in Harrodsburg, Mercer County, Kentucky, and he stayed there until 1850 when he moved to Columbia, Boone County, Missouri, to become president of the University of Missouri at Columbia. Quite a long ways from that 20-some-year-old kid arriving on the shores of Georgia. While there, he helped establish the Christian Female College, now Columbia College. He and Frances were there for the 1850 census, where he was listed as owning 14 people, identified only by gender and age. Missouri was an important player in the complicated battle over what the future of slavery was to be in the United States that led to the American Civil War. Missouri had applied for admission into the Union as a slave state in 1820, and the conflict over that led to the Missouri Compromise, in which Missouri was admitted as a slave state and Maine as a free state, and slavery was prohibited in the Louisiana Territory above a certain point. In 1854, that was repealed, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, allowing Kansas and Nebraska to choose their status. Emotions ran high, the conflict tore apart families and communities, and there was violence. The Civil War was right around the corner. James Shannon was more than happy to jump right in the middle of the rhetorical part of that fight. He apparently loved the controversy and the limelight. So what were Shannon's views on slavery? His personality was such that once he adopted an idea, he would speak about it loudly and forcefully and little sympathy for other views. He wanted to be a thought leader. Remember that he had said in his youth he was against slavery, but convinced himself through Bible reading that slavery was morally right. He once said during a speech, quote, "Convince me that slavery is a moral wrong, and I pledge myself to preach infidelity all the rest of my life and to prove that God is an impostor," unquote. He believed, or said he believed, that if he were to renounce slavery, he would also have to renounce God. Because of his outspokenness, he was battered by the newspapers and had frequent feuds, which he appeared to enjoy. One newspaper said about him, quote, "Forgetful of all his ministries, careless of the one college which he had ruined and the other which he is fast destroying, regardless of his half-finished scriptural commentaries and unmindful of the proprieties of his station, he has launched into the sea of bitter politics," unquote. In 1854 in Missouri, a staunchly anti-slavery and anti-Shannon newspaper described Shannon as the owner and master of Adams Peabody, the editor of the Journal, slamming Shannon for owning the newspaper, basically, as he is the owner and master of Tony, the colored bell ringer of the college. So now we see Tony in this one little newspaper reference. Tony was certainly the Tony from Liberty County who had sent greetings to his parents and had announced the birth of his son Anthony in Jackson, Louisiana. Was it unusual for an American pastor and educator like Shannon to so forcefully express his pro-slavery views, even though so many of them had them? In a speech, Shannon pointed out that the president of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire had just published a book in defense of slavery. He rejected the criticism that as a minister of the gospel, he shouldn't be involved in this issue by saying, quote, that domestic slavery is a moral question, nay, more a Bible question, will not be doubted, and its defense, especially in a slave state, cannot be regarded as dabbling in party politics, unquote. He went on to say that abolition of slavery under existing circumstances was morally impossible because it would financially ruin the slaveholders. He believed, rightly as it turned out, that the slave owners would never agree peacefully to this. This next part it's hard to say and it's hard to hear. Shannon believed firmly that slavery was good for the slaves, that the two races could not possibly coexist if they were to be made equal in status, and that the Bible not only permitted but ordained slavery. As I mentioned earlier, he argued that to denounce slavery as being essentially criminal is to blaspheme God. A number of his writings using Bible verses to defend slavery still exist if you're interested in his arguments. Shannon died in 1859 in Missouri, not living to see the American Civil War, which he had predicted. It seems likely that his wife, Frances Carey Moore Shannon, would have inherited or managed his estate for his children, who were all minors at his death. She died just before the end of the Civil War, in 1865, and she's buried in the same cemetery. Because of the timing of her death, any surviving probate papers are unlikely to have named enslaved people. So I had resigned myself to not being able to find out much about what happened to the enslaved people Shannon brought with him to Missouri. I searched census records looking for anybody who might have taken the surname Shannon, but I didn't find anything. I heard that some of them may have moved away to another state, but I really didn't think I could go much further. Last October, though, I received a wonderful email from Scott Giltner, who is professor of history and the college historian at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. He's had a side project of researching Shannon, who was the college's first president, and it turned out that he had found information I didn't, and vice versa. It turns out that while Shannon was in Louisiana, he performed a marriage between Louisa, who was held in slavery by him, and John Lang, a free man of color. When Shannon moved to Missouri, he had to and did put up a bond to get Lang allowed into the state. Lang was a businessman, and in the 1850s, he operated a butcher market in Columbia, Missouri. Before the Civil War, he was at one time the largest landowner in the African American community. In 1861, Tony, probably the Tony who was born in Louisiana to the parents who came from Liberty County, was convicted of pouring acid on some mules, and he was sentenced to 39 lashes. He was strung up at Lang's Market and whipped there. According to Scott Giltner, Shannon was distraught over this. The 1850 census record in this image shows that John Lang was living as a free man, but that his wife, James Shannon's slave, was not enumerated. Lang was also instrumental after the Civil War in helping establish the first school for freed people in Columbia called Cummings Academy, and Lang's and Louisa's daughter Cynthia became a teacher there. His daughter Eugenia married John William Boone, known as Blind Boone, a famous pianist and composer who was an important early ragtime musician. Their home is on the National Register of Historic Places. John Lang Jr. managed the Blind Boone Concert Company for 37 years, and his death was announced on the front page of the Kansas City Sun, an African-American newspaper, with the headline, "A Mighty Man Has Fallen." Abhorrent as Shannon's ideas on slavery are to us, he was a force in American history for those ideas, and also for the role he played in the Church of Christ and Restoration movement in American Christianity. How do you write or speak about someone like that? A biographer who wrote an extremely helpful book about Shannon acknowledged the difficulties of writing about him by saying that often institutions linked to controversial figures feel that, quote, better a shadowy reference than a glowing embarrassment, unquote. But he went on to say that, quote, few are without fault, and to dismiss the accomplishments of others because of their controversial stances distorts the history of ideas and events, unquote. That author knows a little something about the few are without fault idea. He's a former communication professor at Truman State University and an elder at the Kirksville Church of Christ, who in 2020, when I started looking for him, was serving probation on charges that he was paying students for sex. So I'll just leave that there. Dr. J.E. Choate, a retired professor, said that Shannon was frustrating to write about because his story needed to be told due to its influence on American church history, but his defense of the institution of slavery, while no less passionate than others of that time, was, quote, so totally out of character for a Christian minister that no sympathy is left, unquote. James Shannon was a complicated and controversial man. My purpose in telling his story today is to remind us in the current day that clergymen and educators during slavery not only owned people and participated in the slave trade, but some believed wholeheartedly in the institution, justified it on biblical grounds, and involved themselves in politics on its behalf. We also tend to think of pro-slavery historical figures as having been shaped by their pasts, growing up in a slave-owning family, being taught since their youth that slavery was right, so it seems preordained that they would be pro-slavery. Yet here we have a case of a man raised in another country, growing up opposed to slavery, and changing his mind in his 20s, whether from actual conviction or opportunistically or a mixture of both. The people James Shannon held in slavery were taken from their families, who had a long history in Georgia and likely earlier in South Carolina. Many Liberty County African American families can trace their lineage in Liberty County back to the early 1800s or earlier, and vestiges of their South Carolina past remain in the names of their institutions. James Shannon broke that sense of belonging for them, carrying them with him to Louisiana, Kentucky, and then to Missouri. I don't know whether by the time of the Civil War they still maintain their Liberty County ties, but after 30 years away, it seems unlikely. I hope through the documents and article about James Shannon on my website that some family historian among them may eventually be able to trace those roots. I'd love to be contacted by anyone who is interested in Liberty County records. I try to make sure that as I process records, I put them online right away, but I have learned a lot about how to research in Liberty County, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who's interested. Please don't hesitate to contact me. Anybody have any questions? You can put them in the chat or unmute and ask them.